Industrial Revolution, an intellectual and artistic hostility towards the new industrialization developed associating with the Romantic movement. The movement stressed the importance of nature in art and language in contrast to machines and factories. Mary Shelley's novels Frankenstein reflected concerns scientific progress might be too edged.
William Blake was an English poet, painter, and printmaker born in London 1757. He wasn't particularly recognized for his work during his lifetime. It was after his death in 1827 that he was considered as one of the most important figures in the Romantic Age. His aim was to create timeless Gothic art infused with Christian spirituality. He was considered a freethinker and a visionary. Many of his pieces were very provocative to the people. For example, he hated the Industrial Revolution. He wrote that it was a representation of the devil and it had to be purged. He hated it due to the use of innocent young children in mines, factories, etc. He wrote this in the book called The Chimney Sweeper. Ivan Ivasovsky was a Russian Romantic painter born in modern-day Ukraine near 1817. He is considered as one of the greatest marine painters in all of history. He was appointed the main painter of the Russian Navy, which is why the majority of his paintings are of seascapes. He also painted numerous paintings with battlefields. Unlike the average artist, he was able to paint something he had in his memory. In fact, he never even drew preliminary sketches. John Constable was a British Romantic painter born year 1776. His field of expertise was landscape painting, and is therefore most famous for his painting Dedham Vale and The Hay of Vane. He was indeed valued in British art, but not enough to make him financially successful. He was not admitted into the Royal Academy, which is an art institution in London, until the age of 52. However, this resulted in him becoming popular in France, where every admirer embraced his work. Joseph Mallord William Turner was a British Romantic landscape painter, but also a watercolorist and a printmaker. He was born in Covent Garden, London, year 1775, and died in Cheyne Walk, Chelsea, year 1851. During his time, his work was questionable. This is due to that landscape painting was not very common. The dominant painting field was history paintings. He is considered as one of the artists who elevated the new field into practice. He is known as the painter of light, considering his beautiful watercolor landscape paintings. His work is also regarded as the Romantic preface to Impressionism. Unlike John Constable, he was accepted into the Royal Academy when only 15 years old.
The Industrial Revolution was a time for drastic economic changes, and with any revolution comes new thinking. The socio-economic changes led to new ideas and philosophies, especially around economy. And where there is economy, there is politics. Compared to the French and American Revolution, where the main philosophies were about nobility and human rights, the Industrial Revolution brought new philosophies mostly around economy, politics, ideologies, ethics, and morality. Here are some of the philosophies where their main concepts circle around ethics, morality, and perception in response to the Industrial Revolution. John Stuart Mill was born in London 1806. Mills is best known for his essay On Liberty. He lived in a time when the Victorian England values judged citizens according to their political stance, if they followed classical Victorian values, or if they followed the newly written Communist Manifesto, which assembled people into groups of workers and owners that acted in a mass. He argued that society's only right to exert authority upon an individual is when that individual harms another. He also believed that a good action is one where the intentions do not matter, but only the consequences. Friedrich Nietzsche was born in Röcken, Germany in 1844. He believed that the universe was in a constant state of change, and therefore any philosopher that described the universe as one way or another was false and harmful. He believed that prejudices were deeply ingrained in human nature, that nationalism was bad to the extent that it creates an instinct to behave in conformity, which will only lead to mediocrity. He was deeply critical of the German nationalism, anti-Semitism, and religious dogma. Many today believe that he was the father of modern fascism, which happens to be a common misconception. Long after his death, his sister Elizabeth, who was the caretaker of his legacy, had actually grossly distorted his work, editing it to support her own vile anti-Semitic pro-Nazi beliefs under his name. Arthur Schopenhauer was born in Germany 1788. His main idea revolved around phenomenology, or how human beings perceive the world around them and what they base their beliefs upon. His famous work on the fourfold root of the principle of sufficient reason, which he wrote when he was 25, stated that all things have a basis in reason. He believed that what determines our actions and beliefs are what we ourselves truly believe, and not what anyone else, like the church or government, tries to force upon us. Since your future no longer depended on, for example, the Bible, but on your own perceptions, he had introduced the idea of uncertainty to one's life. His work on the nature of perception has an enormous influence on modern psychology and arts. Jeremy Bentham was born in Spitalfields, United Kingdom in 1748. He was regarded the father of utilitarianism. A utilitarian action is an action that serves as a benefit for the larger amount of people. But it was above all a means of legal reform to provide an ethical standard with which to eliminate corruption, promote freedom of expression, religious worship, equal rights for women, and the elimination of slavery. He also stood for the decriminalization of homosexuality. The problem with this theory is what is best for the biggest amount can turn out to be a very bad action. For example, if the majority enjoys hurting the minority. The influence of Bentham's ideas about the proper role of government to produce the most happiness and the least pain for the greatest number of people is very much alive today.
Selma Lagerlöf was born in 1858 in Värmland, Sweden. She went to a teacher's college in Stockholm and became a teacher at a girls' secondary school in Landskrona in 1885. She had written poetry ever since she was a little girl, but in 1890 she won a first prize in a competition. The next year she wrote Gustav Berling's Saga, which went unnoticed until it was translated and sold in Denmark, where it quickly became critically acclaimed. A few years later, she became supported by the Swedish Academy, who encouraged her to quit teaching and focus fully on writing. In 1906, she published her most famous work, The Wonderful Adventures of Niels. 2 years later, she received the Nobel Prize. Not only was she the first woman to receive the Nobel Prize in literature, she also became an inspiration to many aspiring authors as well as a proud Swedish symbol. Charles Dickens is a famous English writer. Dickens was born in England in 1812. He died in 1870. His big success was the Pickwick Papers. This was in 1837, the year Victoria became Britain's queen. Dickens lived through the Industrial Revolution. He wrote about how life was changing, especially for poor people. People all over the world enjoy his stories. One of them is Oliver Twist, the story of a poor boy in Victorian times. Book by Dickens can be funny and sad. His stories are full of interesting characters. Jane Austen was an English novelist whose books set amongst the English middle and upper classes are notable for their social observation and insight into the lives of early 19th century women. Jane Austen was born on December 16, 1775, in a village of Stevenston in Hampshire. She was one of 8 children and grew up in a close-knit family. She began to write as a teenager. In 1801, the family moved to Bath after the death of Jane's father. Jane's brother Henry helped her with her first novel, Sense and Sensibility, which appeared in 1811. Her next novel, Pride and Prejudice, which she described as her own darling child, received highly favorable reviews.
The Industrial Revolution changed the availability, distribution, and production of food like never before. Interestingly, this period also brought the first food corruption. With a rapidly increasing population, the food industry had a difficult time dealing with shortages of materials, and in an effort to keep the costs down, bulked up food items with questionable fillers. Tea was a particular target for adulteration because the taxes were so high. Scavengers were sent to retrieve used tea leaves from restaurant trash bins, and the leaves were dried, stiffened with a gum solution, and then dyed back with black lead. Meat quality improved since carcasses were transported rather than live animals, and fresh milk was brought in from the country rather than being dispensed in town from old cows living in the city. The first canned foods appeared in England during the early part of the 19th century. For a while, these foods were more expensive than fresh, but they provided convenience for those who traveled, since cows took up a lot of room on ships. The mass production of canned products appeared in the 1870s, and soon after, mechanical devices were developed to prepare foods for the canning process. By the end of the 19th century, manufacturers used their knowledge of pasteurization to heat foods to the proper temperature for the proper length of time, leading to huge improvements in quality, taste, and safety of the canned products. New crops and methods of farming led to improved food supplies, while new standards for personal hygiene improved health.
During the Industrial Revolution, music flourished. There were two main periods during this time, the Classical and the Romantic era. The Classical period of music started around 1730 and lasted until the 1820s, succeeding the late Baroque period known as Rococo. Much of the classic music was based on the ideas of Enlightenment philosophers, that mankind has right and ability to affect its own environment and the relationship between man and nature. The name classical came from the balance and symmetry of classical Greek and Roman architecture, which had been adapted by this era's composers. This period's music often followed well-defined and strict rules or patterns. The form in a composition would usually contain two different melodies and a clear contrast between different sections. It became much more formal in the sense of careful attention to form, elegance, and restraint. A new importance was given to instrumental music, which led to the development of modern concerto, symphony, sonata, trio, and quartet. During this era, Swedish music broke free from the traditional religious and folk music and followed the French into the new classical era. Sweden also established the Swedish Academy, the Royal Swedish Opera, and the Royal Swedish Theatre. Some of the biggest composers of this time were Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart was born in Salzburg, Austria in 1756. He came from a musical family, and at the age of 5 he could play various instruments fluently, like the harpsichord and violin. He had also started composing and performing at different royal and non-royal courts. He could as well hear music once and then write it down exactly as he had heard it. In 1787 he was appointed Emperor Joseph II's chamber composer in Vienna, where he worked alongside mutually resentful Antonio Salieri. In 1791 he became very ill and died not soon after in his bed at the age of 35. During his life, he wrote some of the most famous and greatest music of all time, such as Ludwig van Beethoven was born in Germany in 1770. His father was an abusive alcoholic who would beat him if he ever played a note wrong on the piano. The family moved around a lot, and by the time he was 12, Ludwig was earning a living and supporting the family by being a traveling organ performer. When he was around 30 years old, he started becoming completely deaf, though this didn't defeat him. During this time of complete deafness, he wrote some of the best works. He was also considered to be one of the best pianists of all time. Carl Michael Bellman was born in Stockholm 1740. He was raised in a wealthy family and later worked for the King Gustav III, but was paid a horrible wage. Many of his works were about sociable drinking, joy of inebriation, and the pursuit of sexual pleasure. Yet behind these messages he placed more meaningful themes such as love, fear of death, and the elusive qualities of the present. He was a poet as well as a composer, and he remains very important in Scandinavia today. He inspires many modern Swedish artists such as Cornelis Vreeswijk and Evert Taube with their music. His two most famous works are the Songs of Fredman and the Epistles of Fredman, each including around 70 songs and many poems. The Romantic era was a complex intellectual and creative movement from 1800 to 1910. It was greatly inspired by the drastic socio-economic and cultural changes in Europe that were being caused by the Industrial Revolution, as well as a reaction against the scientific rationalization and view of nature and a revolt against the aristocratic social and political norms of the Age of Enlightenment. This era is often associated with liberalism, radicalism, and later its long-term effect on the growth of nationalism. It has also been said that this era's music was mainly a German phenomenon, with great German composers like Robert Schumann, Johannes Brahms, Richard Wagner, and Felix Mendelssohn. This went on to inspire many French, Italian, Polish, Hungarian, Russian, Czech, and Scandinavian musicians to follow in their footsteps. The common musical themes were nature, the mystical and supernatural, foreign times and environments, feelings, imagination, and dreams. The Romantic era, as mentioned, spread on to Sweden and inspired composers like Hugo Alfvén, Kurt Atterberg, and Knut Håkansson. Fanny Mendelssohn was born in 1805 Hamburg, Germany. She and her younger brother Felix both played the piano and would often set up small plays together. They both wished to become composers when they grew older. Her father supported this idea for Felix, but told Fanny that the only suitable thing for her was to become a housewife. When she was older, she married the artist William Hensel. He encouraged her to compose. In 1847, she died from a stroke. Because her and her brother Felix were so close, when she died, he fell into a deep depression and died the same year, ironically from a stroke. During her time, she wrote over 400 pieces of music, many of which were for the piano. Johanna Maria Lind was born in Stockholm 1820. Jenny was a famous soprano opera singer and was one of the most highly regarded opera singers of the 19th century. At the age of 9, she was enrolled in Sweden's Royal Opera program, and at 18, she had already performed several times at the Royal Opera in Stockholm. This is also when she made her operatic debut singing Der Freischütz. She then became the prodigy of Felix Mendelssohn, whom she allegedly had a relationship with. In 1941, she suffered from vocal damage, but was saved by respected teacher Manuel Garcia. She later toured Europe and America, and was known as the Swedish Nightingale. Today we have, for example, opera, rock opera, jazz suites, symphonies, string quartets, and contemporary religious music that have been directly influenced by classical music from different eras, very similar to old form, but with a modern touch. As Sergei Rachmaninoff once said, "Music is enough for a lifetime, but a lifetime is not enough for music."